Is it Rivalod in Netherlands or Rivalod?
Yes, Rivalod.
Rivalod, welcome. Thank you so much for calling. How can we help?
Thank you for taking my call. I basically have a question. It's regarding morality and atheism. How can atheists be moral in the absence of a God?
Arden, how can you be moral in the absence of a God?
Well, I have a brain and I have empathy, and I know when people hurt me, it feels shitty, and I don't want to hurt other people because then I assume that they feel shitty. It's also not advantageous for me to hurt people because I would gain a reputation for being a shitty person, and people probably wouldn't allow me to participate in society in the way that I need to. There's a lot of different reasons that you do moral things. My moral compass is harm reduction and causing like good and human flourishing.
Yeah. One of the things to point out is that atheism isn't the lack of existence of God, it's the lack of belief in a God. And I've argued, I wonder how some people can be moral with the presence of a belief in a God, because depending on which God they believe in, the various gods advocate for things or supposedly advocate for things that are immoral. For example, within the Bible, if the God of the Bible is real and true, then the God of the Bible sanctions slavery, and the God of the Bible sanctions women being inferior to men and not being allowed to own property and other things that have done that. If you go to other religions, you're going to find different models of God where I have moral objections to them. So I would say, I don't want to just shrug this off, but if you Google superiority of secular morality, you can find a couple different versions of a talk that I gave about how the secular moral system that I advocate for is vastly superior to any that is put forward by any religion. But I think the question I have to ask you is, how are you defining what is moral? Because if you say morality is that which agrees with the mind of God, and I say morality is that which impacts the well-being of thinking creatures, then clearly we don't mean the same thing by morality. So what do you mean by morality?
Well, I basically, the way I define morality is whatever God says something is right.
Okay. If your definition of morality is whatever God says is right, how do we know what God has said?
Well, I mean, that's another question. I mean,
yes, that's why I asked it. I'm aware it's another question. I'm saying if your definition of morality is that which God says is moral, my next question is, how do we know what God has said? Because I'm not aware that there is a God. I don't believe there's one. And I'm not aware that any God has ever said anything to any human being. So how could we make a list of things that you know, name one thing that you know God said and how you know God said it. One thing.
Well, I mean, he has said a lot of things, but I mean, if you take one thing, it's kindness and being good to other humans.
Okay, so I asked you.
Sum that up.
I asked you to name one thing that you know God has said, and how you know God said it. And then you said he said a lot of things, which I could have predicted you would say. And then you said kindness. How do you know that God said kindness?
Well, if I want to get real deep, I don't actually know. I mean,
there you go. And neither do I. And so if you're going to define morality as something God said, and you don't know what God said, then you have no morality, which means of the two of us, I should be asking you, how can you possibly be moral when your definition of morality is something that you acknowledge you cannot attain at all?
And doesn't it kind of scare you, Rivalod, that your compass is whatever God says? Because what if you became convinced that God said killing your mother was moral? Would you then feel okay about going and killing your mom, or would you have a reservation about that? I suspect you'd probably not be too comfortable with that, right? Like that seems like not a good compass to have.
If comes down from, let's say God appears in front of me and he says, do X. I would actually do it, because if he's all knowing,
Oh, yikes.
no better than me, right?
That's scary.
Well, I find, sure, that is the type of thing that people will say. However, neither you nor me have any example of any God ever coming down and saying, do X. And so until that happens, at a minimum, you have no moral foundation, which means you are necessarily an amoral creature with no hope of morality, because you've based your hope, your moral foundation on something that has not happened and that you can't demonstrate happened. You might as well be saying your morality is whatever Fergalbergle Manergalbergle says.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. It's a word I made up specifically for this purpose.
Okay.
So of the two of us, I have an actual moral foundation that I can point to. And it's not, it doesn't cover everything. It is growing. It is changing. It is based on notions of well-being. Arden has a foundation that is based on harm reduction. While the two of us aren't going to agree on everything related to morality, at least the two of us can have a conversation about our foundations and say, here's where I think this one edges it out, or here's why I think this one edges it out.
And I think we
come
more or
to
less do
agreement.
the same thing by our...
We may find that my concern about well-being is fundamentally identical to her reduction of harm, but at least we can have a conversation about morality. You, with your foundation, cannot do that.
I admit, I mean, I have a belief. I don't have the hardcore proof, that, these things come from a God, but that's where I believe a belief, you need to have some belief, and
Why?
in my opinion,
Why?
Something higher.
Why?
Otherwise, what's the purpose of life? I mean, just,
Well, so that's a different question. What's the purpose of life, to use your own phrase? What do you think the purpose of life is? Because I don't think the purpose of life has anything to do with a God. I don't think there is any externally imposed purpose. I think my life has whatever purpose and meaning I give it.
But wouldn't that be arbitrary? Like, it could be whatever.
It is not necessarily arbitrary, but is it subjective? Yes. The meaning and purpose of my life is mine. Why would I want it any other way? Would you like to be born and have everything laid out for you? Here's who you're going to marry. Here's what job you're going to do. Everything dictated by somebody else. Would you want to live in a world like that?
No, not by another human being. No.
Well, why then, if you wouldn't want it dictated by another human being, would you want it dictated by a God who you can't even demonstrate is real?
I would not mind it be dictated by God, because he would know.
That's sad.
So
that is absolutely sad that in any other circumstance, if the government or your parents or a human being told you what the purpose of your life was, you would start a revolution. But as soon as someone tells you that a God that you have never met, can't identify, can't show exists, as soon as somebody tells you that that God has a purpose for you, all of a sudden you're okay with that. I find that to be one of the most saddening and maddening things I've ever heard, and I've heard it many times. Why are you okay with the notion that some God out there views you as a plaything, and that he doesn't want you to have free will, doesn't want you to be the governor of your life? Why is that okay?
I mean, the way that I think about it, like, if there is a God and he knows everything, I don't see it's right for me to say, I know better than you, because he would have an infinite amount of knowledge. So how can I tell him?
Oh, I didn't say anything about knowing more than a God. How do you know that just because God has a plan for you, that it's a plan that is actually good for you?
That I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot you don't know. And I didn't know it either, which is why I stopped running around acting as if I knew it and acting as if I believed it. Do you at least, because I've got to move on to other callers, Rivalod, but do you at least understand how Arden and I can have a foundation for morality and live a moral life? And those who are advocating for a morality based on God are on questionable footing at best?
Yeah, I mean, Arden explained it, the thought pattern there. So clear it up a little bit, but there's a lot of I'm still interested in this, so yeah.
I appreciate it. I've got to move on to some other callers, but think on it some more and give us a call back.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
So, how on earth can you be moral? It is funny to me.
I mean, I think it's interesting because sure, if there were somebody who knew absolutely everything, and I could be sure of that, and they could tell me this is the path that will lead to, like, I don't know, the most happiness or something for you. But by that, I'm assuming that would be, I don't know. I can imagine if that were true, then sure, I could see where someone's coming from. But if that can't be demonstrated, then why would you listen to what someone says? That's any Joe Blow could walk up to you and say, I know everything and this is the best path for you. And you would be on just the same footing as it was with God. So
yeah, you can. So the people behind the scenes can stick a marker here for this to be cut out. And that's this. I'm supremely confident that there isn't any being that knows everything, because if there was a being that knew everything, they would know my sincere desire to know that they knew everything. And they would also understand that as a being myself who cannot know everything, I could never have a rational basis to determine that they in fact knew everything. If I'm not capable of knowing everything, how can I know who is? Because I would have to have that level of knowledge. And if such a being existed and were moral at all and were good at all and had any interest in me or had any concern about me knowing that it existed, it would know exactly what it would need to do to convince me and everybody else, and it would have already done it. And the fact that that hasn't happened, which I said before, is a demonstration that either that kind of being doesn't exist or that being doesn't want me to know it exists. But in the case of the previous caller, it's a huge assumption to go from, well, maybe there's a God that can serve as a foundation for morality and give my life meaning and purpose. And I'll just go ahead and assume it, because if that being exists, it clearly knows everything. Well, first of all, even if it knows more than you, that doesn't mean it knows everything. And even if it knows everything, there's no demonstration that it is working in your best interest. You've assumed that there's a being, that it wants what's best for you, that it knows everything, that it knows better than you, and that it's going to have a plan and purpose for your life, and yet it's not going to communicate with you and tell you what that plan or purpose is.
Yeah. And I mean, and what standard are we using for what's best for me? Because, like, if I want to advance as much as I can in the society that we have, then I would do things very differently than if I'm trying to live a life that makes me happy and fulfilled and satisfied. So yeah, there's so many moving parts there that
it reminds me a little bit of the call earlier with Hank, with animals, where there's an assumption that just because we're capable of using an animal doesn't, that somehow that's good. Well, it's definitely good for us. But in your case, as somebody who's trans, if there was a God, then that means that a God had you born a certain way and set you up in this position. And what Christians will often say, like, and I don't want to equate the two, that's not what I'm doing, but anytime there's something that Christians would view as an obstacle in your path, being trans, being gay, having whatever, God put that there to grow you as a character and needed you. It's all post hoc rationalization, one after the other, because they can't show that their God exists. And so instead, they're just going to assume the best on behalf of God, no matter what happens to anybody else.
Right. Yeah. Who cares if that makes you suicidal? It's just a good challenge.
Yeah, it was.
Thanks, God.
You needed to overcome that so that you
Really
could come on the Atheist Experience and argue against that God.